Tell me about that time you got arrested.
Which one?
the the one when they like sang.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. I would have been 22 years old, 21 or 22. And I was living in Louisiana, and in Louisiana, it's very different than Utah. As a matter of fact, I found it more like visiting another country than when I went to Europe. The laws are different there, the culture is different there, the air is different there, the smells are different there, and the way of doing things is different there. There was a huge problem with corporations coming down and taking advantage of poor communities and completely destroying their community and polluting. The biggest problem was that the Mississippi River, from its origins all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, along the river people dump chemicals from corporations. So companies will go in and they'll be like, oh, it's just a little bit, and it's a big river, so it won't matter. And then the next company's like, well, they're doing it, so I'm doing it. And by the time you get down to Louisiana, when you're going through the other states, it's one or two here or there, but then you get to Louisiana, and the Mississippi was literally lined with just one after the other chemical companies dumping toxic waste into the Mississippi River. And because the chemical companies have so much money, they pay politicians or they hire people to, pass legislation and to lobby so that the laws, by the time I was there, were such that any given chemical that was illegal to dump, if you dumped it, the fine would be $10,000. But if you disposed of it lawfully, the way you're supposed to dispose of it, it would cost you $1 million for that same chemical, for that same given amount. And I spent weeks at the EPA office going through their records. They didn't have computers back then, so I was pulling out files and going through files and documenting illegal dumps that had been recorded. And it was astronomical, the amount of chemicals that were being dumped in the Mississippi River. And they're like, it's a big river, it can handle it. And when you pull it, because scientists started testing it and saying, wait a minute, the crawfish and the catfish and all these critters in the river are toxic, and they've got all these chemicals in them, and people shouldn't be eating them because they're so bad, and the river's got all this. And all the companies were blaming people upstream, when in fact, there was all this dumping going on in Louisiana. Greenpeace came down because the scientists were calling for help. And so I was with a group called Combined Effort, and Greenpeace came and worked with us and helped us. And then together we got all this documentation so we could get it to the news and let them know what was going on. But Greenpeace went out to some of the places where there were just big, huge, like you could crawl through them, pipes, big metal and concrete pipes that were just built, like somebody had spent a fortune to build these pipes to go from the factory straight into the river. It's like, well, you're not supposed to be dumping in the river, but you've built this huge pipe. Well, yeah, that's just for extra water. No, there was never water went through that pipe. You test the pipe, it's, And so Greenpeace would go out on these boats to film this green sludge coming out, or this stuff, and then, they kept getting all kinds of grief. I was glad I wasn't working with them because they got beat up and they got arrested in bad ways. Like they were abused because they were catching people in the act. The EPA had no budget, so the EPA could only catch things haphazardly. Like the number of the dumps that I was recording were the ones that they caught, but it was maybe a tenth of what was really being dumped. So we realized what needed to happen was people needed to know what was going on. We needed to do an information campaign because the media wasn't going to cover it unless there was something sensational, because they didn't want to cover it unless it's dramatic. So we organized a march from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. It's 50 miles, and we were going to do it in the course of 2 weeks. So the Great Louisiana Toxic March, we called it. And what we did is we literally walked from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, and along the way we would stop at every town that was on the river and talk to people there, and it would be a big event and the news would come and we would have a big town hall. And it was heartbreaking talking to the people in these towns and learning about what was going on that end. For instance, we got to St. Gabriel Parish in Louisiana, and every single woman I talked to there shared a story with me about having miscarriages. And I shared that with my friends who were there from Greenpeace, and so they went and did some research, and they said that a woman had 1 in 10 chances of bringing a child to term in St. Gabriel Parish, and industrial abortions. In other words, the water and the air and the ground were so toxic that a woman couldn't carry a baby to term. And the number of people that were getting cancer along that corridor, they called it the cancer corridor. There was one guy who'd had 10 different types of cancer. And everybody that I know that lives down there has a family member, if not 3, that have cancer. So we knew what we were doing was warranted. And at one point in time, we got down to, we were about halfway to New Orleans, and the mayor said, I want to show you something. And he took us to what's called a Superfund site. So the river was littered with Superfund sites, and a Superfund site is a site where so many toxic chemicals are dumped there that nobody can afford to clean it up. Superfund meaning you need super amounts of money, but there's no money from the government, there's no money from the industry. And they took us to this place that was, and Louisiana is different than Utah. It's not a desert, it's a swampland. So all the underwater water is connected. And in this town, this mayor had been doing soil samples. All the soil was contaminated. You couldn't grow vegetables. You couldn't have a vegetable garden because your carrots would be contaminated. Your tomatoes would be contaminated. Anyway, it takes us to the Superfund site. There's a house right next freaking door. There's a house, and they have a garden. And we had to go knock on their door and let them know, excuse me, do you understand? And they didn't. They had no idea. They're like, well, there's a fence there. I'm not on the fence. I'm like, test your soil. You'll see. The friggin' swamp was bubbling. Like in the movies. Like bubbling. It wasn't bubbling because it was a thermo, area like in Yellowstone. It was bubbling because the chemicals were creating chemical reactions. And there was green slime and there were barrels. Like, to me, it was shocking. I'm from Utah. We love our environment here. And it was like a bad movie, like a bad Mad Max movie. Anyway, we're getting a ton of press because we have planned this really well. And we get to New Orleans, and the last stretch was to do a march across the bridge and into a big park. And we got the permit, because you have to get permits for things like that. And at this point in time, as we were going and as the media was, following us, the march kept getting bigger. When it started, there were probably 100 of us. By the time we were crossing the bridge in New Orleans, there were 10,000. And the night before, some leader in the government, I don't know if it was the mayor or the governor or somebody, rescinded our march. Well, we didn't have media then like we do now. We didn't have Facebook or Twitter where you could say, oh, march canceled, there's no permit. No, we've already got, everybody's planning on being there. The news has been out. Everybody knows there's this march across the bridge. It's like, well, we don't have a permit, but we can't stop it. It's too late, So we marched across the bridge, and a group of us who had these yellow shirts. Actually, the yellow shirts just said the Louisiana Toxic March, but on the back it said Marshall. And we were the people who were trained as peacekeepers. So one of the things you learn early on when you practice civil disobedience is that companies like Dow Chemical will pay for someone to come and sabotage the event. And so we need to have people there to, make sure somebody, when the cameras are running, that they're not throwing punches or doing something illegal. And so that's what the marshals were. And people on the march knew that if they saw trouble, to go to a marshal and they would be able to get help. This is the Louisiana Toxic March, and it's November 11th through the 20th, 1988. And I got arrested because I was wearing this t-shirt. And everyone wearing one of these t-shirts got arrested. And the police officer who was putting the handcuffs on me was apologizing profusely the whole time. And he's sitting there telling me and crying and telling me how his daughters are sick and he's afraid because he's tested his water in his house and that they boil their water and they buy water, but they still have to bathe in it, and that he thinks that's why his daughters were sick. Anyway, so they arrested us, and they had arrested us thinking we were the leaders of the group, and that by arresting us, the march would end and the rally would be over. That's what they explained to me as we were driving, that's what the plan was. Anyway, so we get down to the jail. So they put us in the packing wagon, take us to jail. Turns out the jail is only a mile away from the park. I mean, it's like really close. So we get to the jail, and I'm the only woman. The rest of the marshals are all men. And so they go in the drunk tank, and I get put in this cell all by myself. And I'm a little claustrophobic, so it was a little freaky. So I'm, just trying to do stuff to calm myself down and be there. And I'm looking out this little teeny window and seeing my friends across the way. This is after they've mugshotted me and fingerprinted me. Then I'm well, first off, I didn't want to sit down.
Right.
The place is nasty. I mean, it's just this little, like 5 foot by 8 foot cell, maybe 6 by 8. I don't know. It's this little teeny space. There's a toilet that's just filthy, and there's stuff on the wall, like, I don't know if it's somebody's, smearing body fluids. It's just nasty. You don't want to touch anything. And then the door opens, and some girl comes in about my age, and given the way she's dressed and the way she looks, she was either arrested for drugs or prostitution. I'm not sure. I didn't want to pry, and I didn't want to judge. It was just like she was there. Nervous conversation for just a moment, hi, how are you? And she's looking at me like, why are you making conversation with me? And then there was this noise. And we both stop and listen, and this noise is getting louder, and it's getting louder, and it is singing. And I was absolutely mesmerized and floored and inspired and just couldn't hardly contain myself. And I'm just getting giddy. I'm locked up in jail and I'm giddy, and she's freaking out. What is that? What is that? Why are you excited about that? What is that? And I'm like, that's my people. I knew. Those were the songs I had been teaching people for the 2 weeks. I grew up at Marmalade. I knew all the protest songs. I had spent 2 weeks marching with people, teaching them every song I knew. And they were singing them. And they were coming. And all of a sudden, it's so loud. Like they are right outside, the jail. And all of a sudden, the door opens. The person in charge, cop, says, hey, Angel, out, yeah, done. And he's got my friends, and they're processing us really quick. They told us it was 24 hours to process us. Now, all of a sudden, they're getting us out of there as quick as they can. Like, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes they had us out of there. And they wouldn't let us go in the front door, and we're like, why? And they're like, because there'll be a riot. I'm like, why? What's going on? Your damn march has surrounded the jail. So the people had come. It's only a mile. So the organizers of the rally had said, well, let's go get our people. And they had marched from the park to the jail. And that's how much time it had taken them, the time it took to check me in and whatever. And they sang the whole way. And as they got closer, you could hear them. And then they surrounded the jail singing. And they got us out of there. It was awesome. And yeah, so then they let us go, and we had to report to the judge the next day, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2 days. I think it was the next day. And when we got to the courthouse, they called us into the judge's chamber. So there were the 12 of us, plus the Greenpeace lawyer, and the judge said we had two choices. We either sign an affidavit saying that we will not press charges on the state of Louisiana, and we will not file a complaint, and that we will be released and our record will be expunged. And this never happened. And we're like, but wait a minute, it did happen and was illegal. And the lawyer for Greenpeace advised us. He said, if you want to fight it, we will fight for you. Greenpeace will offer you free counsel and you can do that. Problem is, in Louisiana, they can still hold you in jail. They released you, but they're threatening that what they'll do, and this will drag out, and it'll be 10 or 12 years, and they do have the money and the power to push this. And this litigation isn't litigation that would help our cause, and that we probably wouldn't get that much more media from it. So he advised us to drop the charges and sign the forms, and I was like, okay. So that was when I got arrested in Louisiana.
Cool.